Good morning, everybody. We'll begin in 30 seconds. Hi, good morning. My name is Indus. I am your host for our webinar today. It's around 9:30 California time. It's kind of cold outside, but I'm loving it after the severe drought and warnings on saving water, loving the snow up in the Sierras. So with that, we'll begin the webinar. Fantastic topic today around outsourcing governance and, the key of the industry in terms of what's happening, what's buzzing, what's missing, what are the latest findings. And we have two fantastic speakers, Claude and John, whom I'm going to introduce in the next few minutes. But before we begin, just a quick housekeeping items. You may see on your control panel a chat box on your right, and also a way to ask questions in the chat box or directly in the questions panel. So use the questions panel or the chat box panel to ask questions. We will queue up the questions and answer some of those towards the end. Everybody is on mute except for the panelists. This webcast is being recorded. And with that, let me quickly jump to the next slide. So the topic for today is outsourcing governance, what's buzzing and what's missing. So essentially, it'll give you a landscape on why is supplier governance critical in outsourcing engagements, and what are the key attributes of effective supplier governance across contracts, having performance, financial risk and relationship management, and then look at some of the current capabilities and maturity gaps as reported, and some of the strategies to succeed in outsourcing governance, followed by Q&A. So today's webcast is hosted by SirionLabs. SirionLabs is a SaaS product company which helps large organizations to manage their strategic service suppliers and deliver performance to the buyer of these services. Also, the co-host for today is the Shelby Group. Shelby Group is a Sirion certified implementation partner and excel in helping leaders come up with business process change in the way they implement outsourcing services and become successful in IT services. With that, let me introduce you to my two speakers today. Claude Marais is co-founder and president of SirionLabs. Claude was a global leader for contract management at GM. Before GM, Claude had leadership roles at the Coca-Cola Company. Claude is also a fellow and honorary vice chairman of IACCM. We also have John Dreyer. John Dreyer is the president and CEO of the Shelby Group. Shelby is a leader in procurement and supply chain optimization. John works with senior CIOs, procurement leaders to design innovative procurement solutions. With that, I'm going to hand over the mic to John. John, over to you.
Indus, thank you very much, and we're very glad to be on the call today. What I am going to do over the next 5 or so slides is I'm going to set the context for our discussion. Starting in last year and then working through spring of this year, SirionLabs and the Shelby Group went out to the marketplace, to our joint clients and prospects, to get a better understanding of how the industry and our customers are handling the incredible growth of complex services and the oversight of those services to achieve value. So why are we talking about this particular subject? Well, as you can see from the graph in front of you, over the last 20 years, the dollar volume of services procurement has surpassed that of hard goods. It's increased almost 450%, while goods, the purchase of goods have shrunk about 20%. So just a huge change in the procurement landscape. And not only that, but within the services area, there's a part of that called goods as a service, which is a fairly sizable component that is a particular aspect of services purchasing, where perhaps in the past you might have bought an airplane engine. Now you're actually buying thrust for the airplane. So that goods as a service becomes a very key component of what we're talking about. So out of that $3.36 trillion, which again is over $1 trillion more than the goods that we used to only purchase in the past, we now have a component of our procurement landscape that is significantly different from what we've purchased in the past. So let's talk in that next slide about what we're doing to manage the outcomes that we're getting from our services. So what's happened is we've needed to move into something that was inspection. When something showed up on the loading dock, we inspected it. Now we actually need to have an ongoing governance function. In fact, William Deming, who is credited with the rise of Japanese manufacturing with a lot of the quality processes he helped them implement, said that you can expect what you inspect. I'm going to say that one more time because I think it's really important for today's discussion. You can expect what you inspect. And as buyers of complex services, we should heed that advice. But many times in our governance routines, we find a real lack of inspection, and that's not surprising. And the three key reasons that we see for that are captured in this slide. First of all, these services are not simple. They're very complicated. There's a lot of aspects to them that bring out a lot of complexity throughout the life cycle of the relationship that you have with that service supplier. So the complexity alone creates challenges for us to be able to inspect what it is that we're receiving. The second thing, and this is something that Claude will be talking about in his section of the presentation, is just how ineffective our technology and process infrastructure is for getting the governance right on complex services. So there's a true gap between what we need and what we have. And then finally, many organizations are struggling with the high cost of governance. We end up throwing a lot of people at the problem. People are expensive, and that becomes something that shows up on our budgets that we say, gosh, we're spending way too much money trying to inspect this. Are we really getting the value? And so that high cost of governance works against the ability for us to really, truly inspect the work that's being done. So what does that lead to? You know, if we're not really governing, if we're not inspecting well, as we move to the next slide, you'll see what that leaves us with. We end up with what we term as a leakage. So if we could move to the next slide, there we go. So what we have here, if you look at it, there's a dotted red line, and that red line is to represent the expected value of what we were looking for when we ended up outsourcing, when we took on that supplier to help us with that particular function. We expected things to get better, but what in fact is happening, and this is what the research is showing, is that there is a drop in the value of what's being delivered, and depending on which study you look at, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. And that's not just something that happens to an individual company. As we look at the next slide, you'll see that this is actually an industry problem. We have any number of organizations, advisory companies telling us that we have a really big problem. So we'll go back to the Apollo missions. Houston, we have a problem, and it's an industry problem. It's not just a problem that you may be experiencing in your company. As you can see from the University of Tennessee, which has done quite a bit of academic research on this, they see the outsourcing failures represented by about 62% of those are represented by people who just aren't getting the governance thing correct. The International Association of Outsourcing Professionals, we're a member company in that association. It's great for networking with your peers. They have a very strong point of view on this. They believe that there's actually more than 20% value leakage. They see it as high as 25%. And of course, Deloitte talking about their survey, they see it as just a severe underinvestment in the area of being able to govern these contracts and being able to inspect them. So that value leakage, that seems to be something that we're running into as an industry. What's happening here? So let's go to the next slide that we see, and it shows us, we have some graphics here that are meant to represent what's actually happening here. And so what ends up happening is we end up in a bit of a tug of war with our suppliers. And really what it is that when we went with our business case to get approval for this particular outsourcing arrangement, we had a business case that was justified by getting this type of benefit. We're going to see these kinds of cost efficiencies. We're going to see these kinds of value creation opportunities within that engagement. And then when that supplier, due to any number of factors, but certainly the lack of detailed oversight, the inspection piece starts to fall short of that, we end up with value leakage. And so we see that as the difference between the value of what was expected at the time we signed the contract and what actually gets delivered over the course of the engagement. So we want to get that definition out with everyone here so that you can hear our lingua franca, if you will, of how we're going to explain value leakage throughout the course of this particular presentation. So we see two main components. As we move to our next slide, you'll see two main components of value leakage. There's going to be one that everyone recognizes. It's the one that we spent maybe 3 months arguing about as we went to contract terms and conditions. We came up with what we call contract value leakage. And there is all those negotiations that we had on the buy side when we were working on the contract. We said we want to give this function off to an outsourcing organization. So how are we going to make sure that we get what we're expecting? And so we negotiated all these discounts in case service levels were met, earn backs. If we don't have this particular outcome happen, we want some kind of service credit. So there's any number of things that we negotiated, and that's the contract value leakage. Because think about this in your own organization. How many times have you gone back and actually gotten those credits and those earn backs in your contracts? Our research will show you that it's not really something that happens very often. So that's one of the things. But now let's talk about the real penalty that happens when we have a value leakage situation, when the outsourcing partner misses the service levels or the expectations that we have for them. We call that business value leakage. And that is something that hits much closer to home. If you're in the hospitality business and your systems go down and you cannot have reservations happening, or you lose the front desk, that's going to cause real disruption to your business. It's going to create brand dissatisfaction. It's going to cause problems within your operations. Those are the real costs of that value leakage. Those are the costs that are hard to quantify, but were part of our business case when we originally went to outsource. And that, folks, is the aspect of the relationship that we want to show is really the part that you want. You don't really want to capture the contract value leakage. You may use that as a lever, but what you're really trying to do is to get that business value leakage stopped. So that's what we're after in this particular presentation, is to talk about how do we do this? How do we make that happen? And so we do have a point of view, and this is what we've gone through with the survey that we did. And if we can move to that next slide, what you're going to see is the 5 disciplines, what we consider the 5 disciplines of proper governance. And so when we work with our clients, when we talk with prospects, when we talk with other industry experts, there are largely five disciplines that people need to consider as they consider that governance piece. And so we actually did our survey based on these five disciplines and the subcomponents that you see on your screen. So risk management, contract management, performance management, financial management, relationship management. Those five disciplines are the core of this study. They're the prompts for the responses that we had. And now I'm going to hand this off to Claude Marais, president of SirionLabs, and he's going to share with you what our respondents told us in the survey that we conducted. Claude?
Thanks, John, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. So as John has mentioned earlier, we did a joint survey basically to validate what we had observed in the market and to see whether what we have seen is true and whether it is consistent in the industry. We started this in September last year and completed this around March of this year, including doing a real-time survey at the IAOP event in Florida in February to gather additional data. And there were a couple of surprises for us. There was a lot of alignment in our thinking, and those are the kinds of things that I'm going to go through with you today as we look at this. So on the next slide, you will see that what we had was a very broad survey. It captured organizations of different sizes, not just large companies, not just small companies, but focus more on the bigger companies, the 1 billion and higher, and the 10 billion and higher. So we got representation from all of them. At the same time, we got representation from different functions in the organization. So we didn't care where the governance disciplines resided within the organization. We tried to capture that in all, regardless of the organizational structure that they reside in. And then finally, we went across different industries, because one of the things that we do find is that the answers are very, very consistent between industries. The problem is the same, the solutions are very much the same, and everybody is struggling with the same problems. In some cases, maybe a little bit more focus on one than the others. For instance, the banking, financial services, a little bit more focus on risk these days, but in general, all very much in the same space. So if we go to the next slide, and we look at what we found at a very high level. If we look at this at a, oh, I'm sorry, before I go there, let me just say that we asked two types of questions from people. We asked them, how important is this to you? So we looked at it at the discipline level, but we also took it down another level to the process level itself. And we asked importance, but then also, what is your current capacity for that? In other words, what is it you want? And what it is that you really think you need today in this environment. And so we looked at that and we compared those to each other throughout. Now, I'm going to touch this at a very high level, much higher, there is much, much more in the actual research paper, and you're welcome to get a copy of that. So in the time allowed today, I'm going to just touch on the highlights through all of this. So if we go to the next slide, you will see at a very high level, sort of the 100,000-foot level, the outcome of this. And very, very interesting. Regardless of who answered the questions, we see two very clear overarching obligations. Number one, all disciplines are important to all constituents. It's not that only contract management is important or only risk management is important. It's all important in order to be successful. And John's going to touch on that a little bit later in terms of his analogy around flying a plane. But that's a key takeaway, that you really have to be good at all of these disciplines. I think if you look at this 5 years ago, you would have seen a very much more of a focus on performance management, contract management, and some financial management maybe, and very little on the risk side. So we see today a very different picture that we have there. So very consistent across the board, regardless of discipline, and very clear that all the disciplines had to be addressed in this. Let's go to the next slide. And here we can see one of the first surprises that we probably assumed but didn't expect to be as broad as it was, because the gap between what people want, what they say is important to them, and the gap of what they say they have in their organizations is pretty significant, ranging from about 34% in financial and in risk management to as high as 52% in the relationship side. So a pretty big gap consistently across the board. Probably good news for everybody in the sense that I am not alone out there. I am not the only person that have these problems, and I have some ground to make up. You can see from this slide that there is a lot of people struggling with the same kind of situation, where they believe that their capabilities lag behind their what it is that they really need in order to do their job. In one sense, we should not be surprised at this for two reasons. One is the amount of investment in governance of suppliers has not always been great in companies. And number two, technology until recently has really lagged far behind in terms of where organizations should be and where technology should be, and is now only catching up in the post-contract space. So two very big gaps that really explains why, or two very good reasons that explains why that gap should be there. So let's look at this contract management as the first. So now I'm going to go down a level, and I'm going to deep dive into each of these disciplines and talk a little bit more about them. I think if you look at the gap in contract management, and I can make the same case for performance management and to some extent financial management, you know, those of us who started 25, 30 years ago with outsourcing and outsourcing management, it's really a bit of an indictment on us, in the sense that if we are still today having a 38% gap in contract management after a quarter of a century of doing this, the industry probably hasn't done a great job in how they manage the world. So here, if you look at contract management, first of all, still a pretty big gap of about 38%, but I think that statement at the bottom is also very important for us, that 71% of companies say they can't find 10% of their contracts. That to me is no surprise. When I was at General Motors, for example, 2005, we went around the world, collected all the IT contracts for about $3 billion of resourcing. And the third time around, we still found 666 contracts that we didn't know existed. So that is not surprising. As we today put technology in for companies, I can tell you it is, I don't recall a situation where we actually had all the documents for a contract that had to go in when we put it into the system. So that is very common. That is not an exception. And so we see this gap. Now, if we go to the next slide and we look a little bit deeper into this, I think what you see on the top left, very high need, from between 81 and 86% across the board in terms of what people need, but still the 37%, 43% in terms of the capabilities that exist there. And what is even more interesting to me is if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, in terms of obligation capture and document repositories, you see quite a big gap still in terms of people that say advanced or even state-of-the-art. It's a very, very small percentage. And most people sit in that adequate type of environment. And I think that translates for most people to, I have a SharePoint drive where I dump all my contracts in, and that's my idea of good contract management. And we know today that people are saying that is not adequate, that is not good enough, I can't live with that anymore. It is certainly not advanced, it is certainly not state-of-the-art. To a large extent, that is what was available in the industry, in technology, up till very, very recently. So not a huge surprise there, but clearly an area where most people are struggling with today. So if we then go to the next slide and we look at performance management, we see something very similar. We still see a 42% gap, even though we've been at it for many decades in doing this. The other surprising element is data that comes from another study that I've put at the bottom there that says 66% of suppliers believe that they provide services at service levels of 90% or higher. And the same clients are saying, well, we think only 40% of the services are met at adequate service levels. Why is that? And there are a couple of good reasons for that. You know, one of them being what we call the watermelon effect, because most companies still rely on the reports from the suppliers to tell them how well they are doing on service levels, and we call that you know, watermelon effect. Red on the green on the outside, red on the inside. It looks great. It's reported as green, but if you really had the time and you could spend the effort to dig into this, you see that the numbers really don't make sense, and it is not really as accurate as it should be. And as a result, you see a disconnect between what the supplier believes they are level they're performing at and what the clients perceive they are doing that. So on the next slide, if we look at this in more detail, you can see again there that very few clients have either the capacity or the capability to really dig into this and get into the detail. You see that band of adequate again, and to a large extent under capacity, that translates into I have to rely on the supplier. I don't really get in because state-of-the-art capabilities in this space says I will take the raw data and I will validate what the supplier is telling me is going on in this environment. So you see the gaps, but you also see the reason for that, and still a pretty big disparity between what people want and where they really are today in their ability. And a lot of that I can contribute to the fact that people cannot by themselves, due to lack of capability, capacity, or technology, determine for themselves on a regular basis whether the supplier is actually performing at the level that they expect them to perform. So if we go to the next slide. In financial management, we see, and again, I am touching barely on each of these. There's a ton more details in the actual research, so I'm just giving you very much the highlights of all of this. We see a smaller gap there of about 34%, and this actually, to me, is very concerning, because what we see is that people believe they are doing pretty well in terms of the financial management of their contracts, and particularly in terms of the invoice validation. Yet, when you do apply best practices, you typically find an additional 8 to 12% in value leakage. That's a significant amount of money that goes to waste. So again, if we look at the details underlying some of this, we see that the disparity between capacity, particularly when we look at invoice auditing, you see again that broad band of adequate, and that doesn't really jive with the data we saw on the previous slide that says there's still 8 to 12% of invoices that are paid, overpaid or not paid accurately for whatever reason that is. And again, that has to do with capacity, it has to do with capability, it has to do with technology that can support that. But we're starting to see people moving towards a more advanced capability here where they do have the ability and the technology to actually validate at a line item level, at a detail level. But still a lot of gap there in terms of where people believe they are and where I think they really are. I think there's a bit of an overstatement there. Now we get to relationship management, the biggest gap that we see, about 52% in terms of what people believe they need and what people currently feel that they have. Very consistent with the PwC study, for example, where they report only 13 companies say that they actually have a formal SRM process in place compared to where others that don't even have one of those programs in place. And when you get into the details on this, on the next slide, I think you also see how big that gap is, with 77% of respondents saying issues and action management is critical for them, but as much as 71% saying I don't have adequate capability to manage that well. And same with 74% of companies say that I really need 360 reviews, but 83% say that their capability is just not there in this case. So a very big gap in this case, and particularly for me, the most concerning part here is, if I look on the bottom right-hand side again, issues and actions, where so few organizations even have adequate and almost nobody has advanced or state-of-the-art ability to manage their actions and issues. Interesting, though, that if you look at that, the governance forums on the surface looks like everybody says, I at least have that at an adequate level. Now, the difference there between having the forums and not managing the actions and issues, in my experience, often is because what happens in those forums are not measured. We used to call them coffee clubs, because people got together but actually didn't resolve anything in the meetings, and it was not uncommon to see actions and issues with an aging of 300, 360, 370 days with no action on that. So it actually explains, when you start to talk to people a little bit more, that because the governance forums are not measured in terms of performance, you find that what they're actually reporting here is the result of that. They're saying, I don't have a handle on my issues and actions, but I have governance forums. It all lies in, do I have the mechanisms, do I have the capability, do I have the technology that help me manage my forums and the resulting issues and actions a lot more effective than I otherwise would do that. We see that very clear pattern here in the details. And if we go to the next slide, we get to risk management. Now, risk management is a bit of a different animal in my mind. And the reason I say that is what is being reported here is a smaller gap of 34%, but I also believe, as IACCM points out very validly, we are moving from a risk avoidance mindset to a risk management mindset. And I think this information is to a large extent confusing reporting on risk versus managing risk itself. And as I typically talk to about 200, 230 executives a year in the industry, I hear that also a lot, that there's a disconnect between what we are actually reporting on risk versus tying that to the actual performance against the contracts. And on the next slide, you can actually see some of that, because the management of the risk itself around contract performance, obligation management, and the obligations in the contracts, and then the contract itself, very often are disconnected to the reporting of risk, which has other elements, as it should have, but it doesn't really have a direct tie to the performance data and the obligation measurements and management of the obligations with the suppliers. And we see that that disconnect very much in the industry. And again, the sign that it is getting towards the right answer, but it is not quite there. If you look under capability, you see this broad green strip that says it's adequate. It means we're going in the right direction, but we're not advanced. We don't have state-of-the-art. And what that often means, there's a significant adjustment that needs to be made between how we actually manage and what we actually report. And again, when you talk to executives in this space and you talk to regulators, you see much more of a concern on their side in terms of risk compared to individuals that are reporting and have very sexy, flashy dashboards, but it actually doesn't really help you to manage the risk itself. So we see this a little bit in the data also, if we dig deeper, that there is a slight disconnect in these areas. So with that, it hopefully gives you an idea of the kind of data that's coming out of this research that we did. You're very welcome to get a copy of the research itself and look even further into the details. As I said, we just sort of skimmed the surface for you and giving you some ideas around this. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to John.
Claude, thank you very much. And folks, that was a very quick skimming, as Claude mentioned, of the data. And I know that Indus has offered on the chat box to provide a written copy of this. Sometimes it's easier to hold a 40-page research report in your hands. There's a lot of information in there, and it's good to make notes and pass along to other people. So we hope you do take advantage of that. So let's spend 5 slides right now talking about, okay, that was a lot of information that Claude shared, a lot of things that we can resonate with, but what are some of the takeaways that we should get from this study? And the first one that I want to show is let's not fight over dollars. That's the main point here. Holding vendors to the letter of the law, saying, doggone it, we signed a contract and you're going to perform it, that's what we mean by a brute force attempt, is not the real way to go about this. That will backfire on us. You can probably think of times in your professional career where you have taken a hardline approach where that's given you an unexpected outcome that was less than what you were hoping for. So that's something that we want to let you know, is that the research supports this, our experience in the marketplace supports this, that just holding people to the contract because it says so is not really the avenue to go. So how do we go about this? And that's what we're trying to illustrate on this next slide, which could be the most important slide in the presentation. And so I want to draw your attention to it. We're using the airplane analogy for a reason. So if you think of flying a plane, there's the airspeed indicator, there's the altimeter, there's the horizon gauge. There's all these different aspects of a plane, and if you just focus on one, there's a good chance the plane's going to go into the dirt in an angle that's not going to be good for all the passengers. So you don't want to fly the plane into the ground, and to do that, what they teach you, and I don't have a pilot's license, but I've heard enough pilots talk about this, is they teach you to scan the gauges. Always be looking at all of them in a cycle to make sure that you have a holistic picture of what your plane is doing. Very similar to the inspection points that we need to do with our outsourcing arrangements. We have a responsibility to look across all 5 disciplines and their subcomponents to ensure that we are truly understanding how our particular plane is flying. But as Claude has demonstrated, I think beyond any measurable level of detail that someone might require, we're lacking in that. So let's go to the next particular slide. So keep the airplane analogy in mind, and as we think about this, we want to move to the next one, and that is, how do we address it? How do we go about this? And we're all familiar with the carrot and stick approach to vendors, but as Claude likes to say, let's not do the first you beat them with the carrot and then you beat them with the stick. We've got to do better than enforcement, and that's the idea here, is that we have to move beyond that mindset that says that we're just going to enforce the contract. We need to do something beyond that, and that's really this whole idea of how do we get the relationship management and the performance management married together. And it's hard to do that. Without an infrastructure, we have found that as much as 80% of the dialogue between the client and the outsourcing partner is really about who's got the right version of the truth, whose numbers are correct, who's got the proper data. And that's not really the way to do this. So what we're going to do is conclude with this particular takeaway, and that is on the next slide, where we believe that we have to get to a common source of truth. So, and we talk about that, as you'll see in the text here, in near real time. Getting it in real time is not really possible with a lot of the data feeds that you would be getting from your vendors, but the point is that there's a requirement to not just take their presentation that, as Claude says, many times comes across as the watermelon, going back to some of the things that we heard in the presentation where vendors feel like they're doing a good job 90% of the time or more, whereas the person who's experiencing the service feels like it's only about 40% adequate. We need to get away from that. As we talk with a lot of our customers, the information that they end up bubbling up actually comes from the vendor. We need to go back another step. We need to get to the raw data and draw our own conclusions. And that's hard to do, especially with, as we saw, a very inadequate infrastructure for that. So let's talk about that. What do we need to do to bridge that gap? And that's my final slide, and then we're going to move on to Q&A. But the idea here is that we've already demonstrated what the challenges are. We've talked about some of these key concepts. So finally, what do we need? What is it that we need? And really what we need is we need information, the data, for what's actually being done, and to be able to look across our 5 disciplines and get that on a single platform so that we actually have a cockpit where we can scan those gauges. Right now we may have 1 gauge, we may have 2 gauges, but rarely do we have all 5 giving us that information at the time. And then back to one of the other points that Claude made, instead of having a coffee club, can you actually have those forums where you're getting items and actions laid out in a methodical way that has a workflow to be able to get things done in a way that says, yep, we did get that accomplished, and yes, you can pay that invoice. How do we make those things happen? So that's what's needed. So we're in that area, and also to make sure that we continually look at this as a holistic approach to supplier engagement as opposed to just focusing on one particular aspect of the relationship. So with that, Indus, I'd like to turn this back to you and go ahead and go into our Q&A session.
Thank you, John. That's fantastic. Loved your airplane analogy in terms of, we are no longer buying airplanes. We are buying thrust as a service or a jet propulsion as a service. I think this whole movement to subscription economy is putting things on its head. So interesting. Thank you for that. I have 5 or 6 questions lined up. The first one I'm going to read out for you, John. And the question says that you mentioned something about goods as a service rather than goods. And I see that you have broken it down into the whole service has broken it down into goods as a service, IT outsourcing, and others. Can you elaborate what qualifies as goods as a service versus service itself?
Certainly. So if we go back, and it doesn't feel like that long ago, the 90s, I was still, it's funny, 20 years ago, doesn't seem that long ago, but it really was when it talks about how the world has just shifted. We've all seen many things on the millennials. They've never known a world without Twitter in some cases. Well, we used to be in a day where we would just buy a car, and we would move to a lease, which is almost a car as a service, but not quite. But now you have something like Uber, where a car still exists, it's still a good, but I'm just buying transportation. And so we've done that as corporations as well. I used the aircraft engine analogy because that's one that's really changed the aviation industry, where Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, they want to grow their business where they're not just selling you the jet engine any longer. They want to sell you the service contract, and then it gets down to actually how much uptime is it, and then finally the airplane manufacturer just buys thrust. I just want to know that I can move the plane. And so that's the evolution that we're talking about, Indus, and that's what does create such complexity as we start to think about these services that we're procuring, because sometimes they have goods attached to them and they're not just pure services as in a classic outsourcing.
Great. That's a fantastic answer, John. I'm going to read out another one. It says that as we are suggesting that the value is not fully realized and better governance is warranted, what percentage of the problem do we see is on the vendor and what percent is on the client?
Great. I can maybe take that one, Indus.
Sure.
I think that's a very good question, and probably one that when you look at that can be a little bit surprising over time. John made the comment earlier, the quote from Deming, expect what you inspect. I think that is to a large extent part of the problem, because the expectation that you set at the beginning and during the relationship with a supplier can greatly affect what you get out of it. That's number one. I can even go a step back, having now lived on the supplier side and the client side, and very few organizations understand that the way in which you negotiate often drives the behavior of the supplier down the road. For the very simple reason, if and let me just say, I'm a big proponent of hard negotiations. I've done that for most of my life as a buyer of services. But when you go over that line where you have squeezed the supplier so much that they don't see reasonable margins anymore, their behavior is going to be very different from the same supplier having reasonable margins. They are going to nickel and dime you very quickly versus being very flexible. And I think very few organizations put those two together sometimes. The opposite, by the way, is also true. If you don't negotiate to some extent, the supplier is going to take advantage. And so it can go the other way. It's always that balance right? That you have to take. But what I often see also, if you lack the infrastructure and if you lack the technologies and the processes so that you can see where the bottlenecks are, whether it is validating an invoice, whether it is cleaning up issues around performance, whether it is action and issue follow-up, whatever that is, what tends to happen is that the first reaction of the client is the supplier is screwing up. But if you actually go look at the data, in my experience, it's about a 48-52% issue, and either party can be on either side over time, because we often find that where it is difficult to govern, if the client doesn't have good governance processes, the supplier struggles equally well. Now, on the other hand, if the supplier negotiates a deal and they just simply hand it off to their delivery folks and there is no connection there, and by the way, that happens many, many times because the incentive for the delivery guys is to do everything the same way, where the deal was struck in a very different way and the expectations are very different. All comes back to, do I have that infrastructure? When the contract is signed, do I extract those obligations, and do we on both sides have a common view of what the obligations are, and we have agreement on day one, these are the obligations out of the contract. And now do I have the discipline in place to see in my workflows where the problem lies, where the bottlenecks are, what is the aging, what is the speed, who is performing, who is not performing on both sides. You know, if you don't have that infrastructure, you really never get the right picture. And my experience is, if you get the right picture, it's very often a 50-50 kind of situation.
Great. Thank you, Claude. I have another one coming. It says, can you comment on products like Ariba, and if used effectively, how many of these issues can be resolved?
Okay.
That's a great question. I think I'll take that one, Claude, or at least start the ball rolling. So let's not so much talk about a particular vendor as let's talk about a class of product. So in that class of product, that's along the lines of the source to pay continuum. So there's a lot of aspects of that has to do with understanding your vendor base, making sure that you know where you're spending your money, being able to negotiate good contracts, get the contracts memorialized and put into some type of repository, and then be able to transact business based on what's been done. And that has been really geared towards goods. We've been in that part of the industry for a very long time. What we're seeing in our marketplace as the Shelby Group, from a procurement perspective, is that the complex services really drive in different directions other than what the traditional source-to-pay infrastructure is built to accommodate. There will be some aspects of all of the things that we've talked about today that the source-to-pay infrastructures can handle, but there are some detail-level areas and some nuances that become problematic. Being able to have something in that particular infrastructure, in the source-to-pay infrastructure, that would account for how do we do issue and item follow-up. A lot of time there's not a workspace within that infrastructure that allows you to build that workflow, and then to be able to tie that back to the particular performance data. So there's a whole class of products that are starting to come out now that we're seeing in the marketplace that are really geared towards the governance of complex services. It's almost a separate work area for the procurement industry.
Claude, you want to add to that?
No, I think John absolutely hit the nail on the head here. You really have to look at the systems were designed to do and what they are trying to do today. And for me, one of the very simple tests are, how do I handle my contracts? Are they all sitting in a flat file where I can't find things? I don't know the hierarchy of the documents 3 years down the road. I can't tell what the current status of the contract is, versus one that is designed for the services industry where contracts continually change, and I continually not only understand what my contract looks like at the press of a button, but I have a view of my obligations on the client and the supplier side at the push of a button. Very different views of the world, and it's because different systems were designed to do different things.
Good. And that's really part of it too. I'm going to just add one more piece to this, is that within a procurement system, a lot of what's built on is the okay to pay. And being able to come up with the okay to pay on a complex service that may have 16 sources of data and then be needing to be validated through various aspects of the organization, it's not the simple goods receipt that we used as one of the parts of the three-way match in the past. So that's one of the big challenges with complex services, is the rubric that we've had over the last 2 decades on the okay to pay, which means I can process that invoice, is just very, very fractured in the services business.
Got it. Good answer, Claude and John. So I'll take the last one. The question is slightly long, but I'm going to abbreviate it. Is the largest gaps in the data between the views of procurement and those of VMO, the vendor management organization? Each may expect that other to do the contract governance. Perhaps that is where the problem is. Can you comment?
I think so often what it comes down to is that procurement's view, because their responsibility is what happens until the contract is signed. And then they pick up again when they look at an overarching picture of performance at a relatively high level. The VMO has to take that contract, has to operationalize it, i.e., they have to continuously update that contract, has to continuously understand what is in the contract, i.e., what are the obligations and how do they change over time. I need to have the mechanisms to do that, not something procurement typically gets into or cares about. And I have to caveat here, this is changing in the industry. You are starting to see procurement organizations that have a very real focus now on the post-contract side, and they are actually taking on responsibility for that. So when I say this, I'm taking more the traditional view of procurement. So in that case, procurement doesn't have to deal with that operationalization of the contract, and then matching, because remember, traditional three-way match is focused on goods. Three-way match in the services business says, what did the contract say I was supposed to do? What does my performance data say actually happened? How does that compare to the obligations on the contract? And now let me take the invoice and compare that to both the performance data and the obligations in the contract in order to validate my invoice. Very different from the traditional three-way matching in a goods environment, and a ton more complicated with a lot more higher volume of data, and by the way, constantly changing environment, right? So the job of the VMO is very different from the traditional PMO job, procurement job. I do see in companies today that some of the VMO work is starting to move to the procurement side, but that's still very few companies that do that.
Great. Thank you, Claude. With that, we are at the tail end of the webinar, and I thank you all for joining me today. It's around 10:30 California time, and you heard from John, you heard from Claude. These are the two fantastic thought leaders in the contract and supplier performance space. So John and Claude, thank you for coming down and spending some time with us. And I'm going to wrap up before I wrap up, just a reminder, if you'd like to receive a printed copy of the survey, as John and Claude both mentioned about it, is 60-page in a book form, fantastic to read, annotate, take notes, and enjoy your holidays along with it if you want. But again, thank you all for coming here. Happy holidays, and hoping to do another one in January.